Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us for Drag Through the Gardiner Collection. I'm Leila and I'll be facilitating the event. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a white woman with a short brown bob, currently sitting in my very green sitting room in southeast London surrounded by plants. So before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, Jacob's talk will be followed by a Q&A, so please post any questions you have in the chat and I'll pass them on to Jacob to answer at the end. Also, a quick reminder to you all that the seminar is focused on drag and gender nonconformity in history. So when thinking about your questions, try to keep this historical context in mind. We want to ensure this event is a safe, inclusive space for everyone attending, and we will be moderating the chat throughout to make sure the questions and comments are appropriate and on topic. I'm also delighted to add that we have James Gardiner, who collected the photographs Jacob is discussing today, joining us for the Q&A, and he is happy to answer any questions you have about the collection itself. Links to the material discussed will appear in the chat as we go, so please do take some time after the event to look at these items, as well as the collection more generally. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Jacob Bloomfield, who will be presenting this afternoon. Jacob is the Kunstkolleg postdoctoral fellow at the University of Konstanz and an honorary research fellow at the University of Kent. His research is focused primarily on the fields of cultural history, the history of sexuality and gender history, and he is the author of Drag, A British History. So over to you, Jacob.
Yeah, thank you, Leila, for that kind introduction. Just to start out, I'll just start with a little anecdote about the James Gardiner Collection. I first became acquainted with it when I first started my PhD program. First of all, I assume everyone can hear me, yes, Leila? Yes, good, okay. Well, I first became acquainted with the James Gardiner Collection during my PhD program, and I sort of assumed that James Gardiner was someone who had died, and I thought maybe he kept this collection a secret, and his long-suffering wife maybe found it in an attic when she was clearing things up after he died. But then about 2 years after I first became acquainted with the James Gardiner Collection, I was at an event at the Bishopsgate Institute, and I met a very handsome gentleman, and I said, "Hi, my name is Jacob." He says, "Hi, I'm James Gardiner," and he seemed alive to me. Actually, I'm not a medical expert, but he seemed alive, and I wasn't communicating with him via Ouija board. It was in person, so I'm very glad that James is alive and kicking and continuing to accrue materials, perhaps for a sequel to the famed James Gardiner Collection, which we can all benefit from. And so yeah, it's great to have him here and have him be involved, and it's been a great privilege to be able to rifle through his old belongings. Next slide, please. So in terms of the structure of this talk, I'll be referring to a book I recently published called Drag, A British History. I'll first give a summary of the book and its main arguments, then I'll define some key terms, and then I'll give you a little bit of a tour of the book. I'll provide evidence in support of my key arguments. I'll discuss some key figures, performances, and events the book covers, and I'll do this all with reference to various items in the Gardiner Collection, and then we'll have a Q&A. And I should also just say that the Gardiner Collection is digitized, so you're free to peruse it on your own time. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource for specialists and non-specialists alike. You know, if I do anything here, it's to promote this wonderful collection. So next slide, please. Okay, so what is my book all about? Well, it's about the history of male drag performance in Britain between 1870 and 1970. Why did I choose those years? Well, I think 1870 is when our present day ideas about drag were taking form. For instance, you have the popularization of the term drag. Drag, meaning cross-dressing, first appears in a British newspaper in 1870, and that's in reference to the Bolton and Park case, which you might have heard of. They are also known as Fanny and Stella. Neil McKenna wrote a great book called Fanny and Stella, which you can read. So you see Ernest Bolton there on the side of your screen. That's an item from the Gardiner Collection. And so anyway, Ernest Bolton and Frederick William Park were two female impersonators, as they were known then, but they didn't only participate in female impersonation on the stage. They also donned drag in their private lives and in public. They did something which a lot of drag artists wouldn't even do today, and that was go out and drag in the daytime and wolf whistle at police officers and such. So in 1870, they were arrested for the fun-sounding crime of conspiracy to commit sodomy. It wasn't like the police didn't see the sodomy happen, but Bolton and Park had a spreadsheet prepared with all the plans for the sodomy they would do, presumably. Then in their subsequent trial, the prosecution tried to connect drag with sexual immorality and sodomy, but the prosecution wasn't successful in this. Bolton and Park were acquitted, and Ernest Bolton actually went on to have a successful drag career in New York as well as in Britain after the trial. So you can see Ernest Bolton there in some of their finery. And then in 1870 also, there's new ways of talking about drag and what I would call gender variance, and I'll define that term, gender variance, in a little bit. But you have, for the first time, medical practitioners start to say that if you see somebody, for instance, a cross-dressed man, if you see an effeminate man, a gender non-conforming man, for example, or woman, then it's not just a man wearing a dress, for instance. The fact that the man is wearing a dress tells you something about their persona, and the late 1860s and early 1870s is when this idea starts to gain traction among sexual scientists, medical practitioners, and sexual theorists. Then you also have drag as a mass cultural form, which I'll explain in a little bit. But I talk about in the book how, particularly between 1870 and 1970, 1870 is when theater really starts to take off as the arguably the dominant cultural form of the Victorian age, more popular than novels, for instance. All sorts of different classes are going to the music hall. Before, the music hall would have been more the preserve of working class men, but now now women are going to the music hall, the middle classes are going to the music hall from the second half of the Victorian period. And drag is right there along with it. And I talk about in the book how drag was really at the forefront of all sorts of entertainment media that you see. So for instance, when theater is taking off, as I said, drag is at the forefront of that. When radio first becomes popular, drag is at the forefront of that. We often think of drag as a visual medium, but there was drag on the radio. When television and film first start to become popular, drag is at the forefront of that. So it really is a mass cultural form, and people of all sorts of different classes and regions are seeing, people from all different walks of life are seeing drag. And then 1970, the book sort of ends in 1970, and that's not to say that drag after 1970 is uninteresting. I think, there's obviously a rich tradition of drag after 1970. But I think there's sort of a different story there. You have pure drag being more overtly claimed by gay culture and gay politics as well, while you have more diluted forms of drag permeating popular media, for instance, rock and pop music. So, for instance, in 1969, the Rolling Stones perform in Hyde Park. It's right after the death of Brian Jones, and Mick Jagger is wearing a Greek cassock. But this Greek, the audience and the cultural observers aren't really familiar with Greek cassocks, so it's interpreted as, quote, a little girl's party frock. And this is seen as an inciting incident in terms of rock and pop performers presenting themselves in drag-adjacent modes, let's say. So I think after 1970, of course, drag is still around. Drag is still a part of British popular culture, but I think there's a different story there. Next slide, please. Sorry, I keep on forgetting that I have a wonderful assistant. I could get used to this. I've moved up in the world. Now that I'm getting slides moved from me, my index finger will shrivel up due to underuse after this. So anyway, what are the main arguments of the book? So as I said before, historically, drag has endured as a critically and commercially popular art form. I say in the summary for the book that the book attempts to affirm drag centrality to modern popular culture. And then, secondly, I argue that drag has held a variety of meanings for observers and practitioners. It didn't just mean one thing, for instance, homosexuality. Cultural views of drag's relationship to sexuality were inconsistent, varied, and not uniform, and audiences could just as easily associate drag with, for instance, convalescence after the First and Second World Wars, as I'll discuss, or working class culture, things that didn't have anything immediately to do with sexuality necessarily. And then in making these arguments, the book interrogates broader themes in modern British history, such as the history of censorship, working class culture, the aftermath of the World Wars, and the so-called sexual revolution. Next slide, please. So just continuing on from that in terms of the arguments I try to make with the book isn't aiming to be contrarian. I'm not trying to be a well actually guy, as they say on the internet. I'm not trying to tell people that their views of drag are wrong. Instead, I'm trying to historically contextualize notions that we have about drag today. So some questions the book answers in this respect are the origins of this connection between drag and gay culture, or drag and queer culture. Why are they so frequently linked together? How did those connections develop, and how queer or gay is drag really? Then drag and controversy. Is drag inherently transgressive? How has drag been subjected to state, social, and cultural modes of regulation in the past? And then, to what extent is UK drag culture distinctly British? And I'll hit on all of these as we go on. Next slide, please. Just to get some key terms out of the way first, so you know what I mean when I'm talking about concepts like drag and cross-dressing, etc. Drag, the traditional definition, would be men dressed as women or women dressed as men in the context of a performance. But I think a definition that applies to the present as well as the past is simply a kind of performance that comments on gender. And now drag is getting increasingly avant-garde. For instance, you have a tranimal drag where people dress up in sort of amorphous, sometimes grotesque shapes. But I'd argue that the commentary on gender is still there. And actually, in the book, I mentioned this tranimal phenomenon. And my aunt called me up. My aunt, who lives in Maine, called me up the other day, and she says, I learned a new word from your book, tranimal. So my book is enlightening aunts from Maine all over the region. So that's, you know, an important contribution that I'm making. Then just as a side note, drag has been used as a synonym for cross-dressing, but the book uses drag to mean drag performance. Then by cross-dressing, I mean the wearing of clothes in public or private, not typically associated with one's sex as assigned at birth. Female impersonators, a historical term for men who wore women's clothes in the context of performance. And I'll use this term, female impersonators. I know it's kind of outdated, but this is what most of the performers who I discuss, that's how they would have referred to themselves. Then by gender variance, I mean gender presentations or gendered understandings of oneself expressed through comportment, clothes, or other means that are unconventional in a given cultural context. And then transvestism, cross-dressing that's suggested to be habitual, compulsive, or generally done repeatedly. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's dig into the first argument I'm making in the book, which is drag as a mass cultural form. So I argue that drag artists were some of the most popular artists of their time. Drag was an adaptable art form, as I said, on the forefront of new media. Drag appealed to audiences of different regions, classes, cultural tastes, etc. Drag resonated with audiences for a variety of reasons. And drag spoke to certain zeitgeists and pertinent concerns. On the right here, or on the side, I don't know which direction it is for you. I think, I don't know. Anyway, that's Mrs. Shufflewick. You can see that item in the lovely Gardiner Collection. Mrs. Shufflewick's, Miss Shufflewick was known as Rex Jameson, offstage. And, you know, famous for her black cap performances, where she was known for her kind of crude, almost kind of stand-up comedy stylings. You can listen to it. I think it's on YouTube, actually. Mrs. Shufflewick came out with an album called A Drop of the Hard Shuff Live at the Black Cap, which is very good. It includes lines such as, "He kissed me on both cheeks, and I was doing my shoelaces at the time." So, you know, things like that. Mrs. Shufflewick also appeared on radio as well, so another drag performer on the radio there. So, next slide, please. Okay, so here's one example of a drag phenomenon I discuss in the book. I discuss this phenomenon of ex-servicemen's drag reviews. This phenomenon started out, or was popularized by a troupe called Le Rouge et Noir. You can see Reg Stone from Le Rouge et Noir there. Le Rouge et Noir were a troupe of ex-servicemen performers. They'd performed for their fellow servicemen during the First World War, and, you know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this phenomenon of the wartime concert party where troops would perform for each other. They do all sorts of performances, but drag performance was a big part of it. They'd perform for one another on the front during the war. But I find Le Rouge interesting because they then took this wartime act and performed it for the British public. So right after the war, with the support of higher-ups in the military and the War Office, they performed at Windsor Castle, and they went on to do tour all throughout the interwar period, doing these light entertainment shows, these light entertainment drag shows. And not only were they popular on stage throughout the interwar period, they were one of the most popular performers of the interwar period, but they also appeared on radio, again, drag on the radio, And they also had a film franchise. And in fact, the first Le Rouge et Noir film, which is called Splinters, you can see it on iPlayer, possibly because I harangued the BFI to... Oh, it's not on iPlayer, sorry. It's on BFI Player. And maybe I played a role in getting it on there, because I think I might have harangued the BFI about it, annoyingly. This was the first Le Rouge et Noir film, Splinters, was one of the very first British-made talkie films, so it was a big technical achievement at the time, and Le Rouge et Noir are not only in the film, but they're the stars of the film. They're the subjects of the film. So this speaks to how mainstream drag was, and how mainstream Le Rouge et Noir were in particular. Then, after the Second World War, the phenomenon of ex-servicemen's drag reviews took off again. You had several shows, such as This Was the Army Here. There was another show called Soldiers in Skirts, another called Forces Showboat. And some of these shows lasted from the mid-1940s through the mid-1950s, so that, continuously. So they played for a long time after the Second World War. And what I think is interesting about these shows were the shows were mostly comedic in nature. There were some dramatic turns, such as, earnest dance numbers and such, but they were mostly comedic in nature. But the performers made an earnest attempt to be deliberately alluring. As you can see here, you can see Reg Stone, and you can see Tommy Rose and Sonny Dawkes in This Was the Army. They look like the quote-unquote glamour girls of the time, of the period. Sonny Dawkes and Tommy Rose would not look out of place with a lineup of pinup girls of the period. So they made an earnest attempt to be alluring. And one interesting thing I found, next slide, please. One interesting thing I found about the critical appraisal for these shows was, yes, the reviews discussed the admiration the critics had for the servicemen performers participating in the war effort. So this was mentioned, obviously the ex-serviceman aspect of the show was a draw, but what was mainly emphasized was just how sexy the performers looked. And it was really interesting to see just how the excruciating detail these critics, used to discuss these performers. For instance, there's one review which gushes over Reg Stone's powdered white arms and perfectly manicured fingernails and positively pretty little aspects of femininity. So the critics and audiences were really taken in by these performers' beauty and their allure, and that was actually what I found to be the main takeaway from the shows. Yes, the ex-serviceman aspect was important, but mainly reviews, critics, and audiences emphasized just how hot the performers were and how much fun they had being taken in by these performers. And if you were a so-called heterosexual man who had a crush on one of the performers, that wasn't considered a crisis of sexuality. That was considered part of the fun. And so here you have more items from the Gardiner Collection. That's, again, Reg Stone in and out of drag. On the right, you have Ronnie Stewart of Soldiers in Skirts. I found in the archives Ronnie Stewart actually got in trouble with the Lord Chamberlain's office, Britain's state theatre censor at the time, who I'll discuss in a little bit. There was a scene in Soldiers in Skirts called Cutting In, which was sort of a play on, if you're at a formal dance and you want to dance with someone who's already got a partner, you approach them and say, "Mind if I cut in?" And hopefully the person who the object of your affection is dancing with obliges. And in this sketch, it starts out with a formal dance. Someone says, "Mind if I cut in?" And then the cutting in happens at increasingly inappropriate times. So, for instance, One man and a woman are, a woman played by Ronnie Stewart, are exchanging wedding vows, and then just as the wedding vows start, another guy goes, "Mind if I cut in?" And then he is the groom suddenly, and it ends with the man and the woman again played by Ronnie Stewart about to have sex. They're near a bed, and Ronnie Stewart is stripped down to the waist apparently, and then another man suddenly appears and says, "Mind if I cut in?" To take over. So the Lord Chamberlain's office did not approve of Ronnie Stewart being stripped down to the waist in that sketch. So he got in a little bit of hot water there. Next slide. There's Bartlett and Ross, who were a famous drag duo. They were in the show Force's Showboat, which was another popular ex-serviceman's drag review in the post-Second World War period. This photo of them, again, from the Gardiner Collection, was taken in 1938. And so by 1947, they were sort of getting to grand dame status. But they were still handing out. I found that they were still handing out postcards depicting them in their youth. So I would find cards signed, Bartlett and Ross, or from one or the other, 1940 something, 1950 something, but they were still handing out images from decades ago. So that's I found that quite interesting. Next slide. Okay, here we have some more popular drag performers. On the left there is Burt Errol, born in Birmingham, known for his quick changes. Of course, his quick changes were assisted by his wife. It was a popular trope in drag at the time to be able to change outfits very quickly. And that would impress the audiences, and so drag artists would change into multiple glamorous outfits within a very short period of time. And as I said, Burt Errol also had a falsetto voice, and he was popular not only in his native Britain, but also did tours of North America and continental Europe and Australia as well. On the middle there, you have Mystery Gauze, and this is actually I'm becoming maybe a discount bin James Gardiner here, because this is actually from my personal collection, the one in the middle there. Burt Errol is from the Gardiner Collection. In the middle is a postcard I've accrued. And Mystery Gauze is someone who I kind of like to think that I quasi-discovered or rediscovered. I saw them mentioned in a list of performers who performed in Great Yarmouth in the early 20th century, and that's where everything was happening, man. So I said Mystery Gauze. That's an interesting name, and they performed in Britain in the early 20th century, in the 1900s, and then again in the 1910s. They came back. And they were billed as alternatingly as Canadian, Indian, and colored. And so I thought that's interesting, and I thought, maybe they were genuinely an Indigenous Canadian, or perhaps even Canadian Indian could refer to someone who's South Asian, or of South Asian extraction, but lived in Canada. Or it could be that they just, dubbed themselves Canadian Indian to add a sense of exoticism to the act, which wasn't an uncommon trope. And then after I published the book, somebody named Connell O'Donovan, who's a historian, kindly got in touch with me and said, "Oh, I think I know I think I've come across this Mystery Gauze person too. They billed themselves as William Gauze, and they performed in all-black minstrel troupes in the United States." So Mystery Gauze was African American, and they performed in minstrel troops consisting of entirely African American performers, which wasn't unusual at the time because, unfortunately, if you were a black performer and wanted crossover success, especially you had to appeal to the way in which white people were used to seeing black people represented in popular culture, and that was unfortunately, based on minstrelsy. So, Mystery Gauze, I'm pretty sure, was actually African American, but billed themselves as Canadian Indian, presumably meaning Indigenous Canadian, to add a sense of exoticism to the act. And again, they were known, like Burt Errell, they were known for their falsetto vocal range, and they tried to deceive the audience into thinking they were a genuine woman, but de-wigged at the end of their act to reveal the truth there, which was a common theme among drag artists at the time. Then on the right, you have Julian Eltinge, arguably the most popular female impersonator of the 20th century, had successful stage shows, had a theater named after him while he was in New York, while he was still performing. And he also toured Britain, and he performed for Edward VII, actually. And I heard I'd heard an anecdote about this performance for Edward VII. I'd heard that Julian Eltinge, when he performed for the king, was given a white bulldog, and I thought, that sounds like an inconvenient gift if you're going back on an ocean liner, to New York, presumably. Did he expect the bulldog to be gifted to him? What was the story with the bulldog? But actually, I found out somewhat recently. I know someone who's doing a biography on Julian Eltinge, which is great, and they told me that it seems like what actually happened was Julian Eltinge, he did genuinely meet the king, but then later he got this white bulldog just at the pet shop or something, and told everyone that the white bulldog had been given to him by the king. So that is actually that is one piece of misinformation in my book, which I admit to. I say that the white bulldog was given to him by Edward VII, and that is not true, unfortunately, or it might not be true, unfortunately. So hopefully that's the only untrue thing you'll read in the book, but I was wrong about that, and I spread some misinformation, so just call me Joe Rogan. Next slide. Neil Young is gonna send me an angry letter about that. Here's Julian Eltinge from a postcard in the Gardiner Collection, in full color there, and this would have been around the time that Eltinge performed for the king. Next slide, please. Sorry, I keep on forgetting that. On the left there, you can see John Lind, who's a Swedish female impersonator. On the right there, you have Derkas, who is a Spanish female impersonator, but both made impressions in Britain. And one of the reasons why I wanted to bring up these performers who, like Burt Errell, British-born, but made an impression in North America and continental Europe and Australia. People like Mystery Gauze, who came from North America and made an impression in Britain. Julian Eltinge, popular in America, but also popular in Britain. The reason why I'm bringing up these figures is because, in part because there's this notion that with the success of RuPaul's Drag Race, which is something that hangs over these whole proceedings, there's this notion that with the influence of RuPaul's Drag Race, the drag scene is becoming more globally homogenous, because everyone is kind of drawing from the well of RuPaul's Drag Race. And, I think there is something to that, but I also want to emphasize that long before RuPaul's Drag Race, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, there was this global network of drag. Drag artists were moving fluidly from North America to continental Europe to Britain, etc., and they wouldn't have to change much about their act. I think part of that is because, if these drag artists are drawing from feminine glamour, totems of feminine glamour, then, that's becoming more homogenous too, as you have plays being performed, the same plays being performed in, for instance, Broadway and the West End. Then, with the influence of Hollywood, you have a more kind of homogenous vision of feminine glamour in the West. And so I think if you are performing glamour drag, you are drawing from the same influences throughout the West, at least. But I want to emphasize that even in the 19th century, early 20th century, there was this global network of drag, and drag artists could move from one continent to another without having to alter their act much, and they could be celebrated in multiple, in different cultural contexts. And then the center there, moving on from global to more regional, in the center there, you have Billy Manders from the Wellcome Collection. Billy Manders, most associated with Rhyl in Wales, and is a sort of local hero in Rhyl, and fronted a group called the Pierrot troupe called the Quaintesques. But Billy Manders was also on radio. I think I counted, don't quote me on this, but I think I counted he and the Quaintesques appeared on radio close to 10 times between the 1920s and 1940s. Still a national presence, but thought of as kind of a regional figure and very associated, again, with Rhyl. Next slide, please. And here are some more photos of John Lind, or John Lindstrom, or Lind, however you want to deem him. And then here's a very fun photograph of Billy Manders. Then he was called Willie Manders earlier in his career, but that's Billy Manders / Willie Manders in and out of drag. And I like that trope. You do see sometimes, and you can see these in the wonderful Gardiner Collection, would you call them double exposure photos? I'm unfortunately not very au fait with photography, but photos that depict the drag artist in and out of drag in the same frame. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I also want to say a big compliment to James. If you look at the descriptions of the Gardiner Collection photographs, it really shows that James is very clued up on fashion history, and you'll get very specific names for the types of clothes and accessories that the drag artists feature in these photos. So you'll get a great lesson in fashion history as well, reading the lush descriptions of the photographs in the Gardiner Collection. And again, you can see those online. So another type of drag that weighs heavily on us, I guess, is the pantomime dame. Often if you probe people today, if you ask them what is drag to you, they will probably mention glamour drag and the pantomime dame. And so the book covers pantomime damery. I argue that we often think of the pantomime dame as this sort of static museum piece that's been more or less the same since the 19th century. And we also sort of think of the pantomime dame, or at least many of us might, we often think of the pantomime dame as this sort of slapstick clown figure. And while I think there are elements of those two ideas that aren't untrue, I think there's a lot more to that. And I talk about Dan Leno and Arthur Lucan in particular. They were pantomime dames. They performed the dame in pantomime and also outside of pantomime. And they really brought a believability to their characters. They brought a sort of Stanislavski-esque approach to the dame role. And their dames, you know, they involved a lot of slapstick, but there was also a lot of pathos intermingled with the slapstick comedy, and that gave their performances quite an emotional range. So on the left there, it should be the left, is Dan Leno, one of the most popular performers of the 19th century. He also appeared in drag in very early film. You could see him be do his Mrs. Kelly role. You can see it on the top right there. On Kenora Viewers, for instance, a very early film, he performed his Mrs. Kelly comic sketch / song on wax cylinder recordings. So again, you have drag and, you know, very early commercial recordings. And then you have Arthur Lucan here. Arthur Lucan, if you don't know, was famous for a character named Old Mother Riley. The character was called various things throughout the years, but Old Mother Riley was what stuck. Arthur Lucan performed with his wife, Kitty McShane. Kitty McShane played Old Mother Riley's daughter in the act, and that was probably the least weird thing about their relationship. They had a very tempestuous offstage relationship. You can see there's a TV film made about their lives called On Your Way, Riley. I think that might be on YouTube or findable somewhere. So they had a very tempestuous offstage relationship. But Arthur Lucan, again, played this character in a very believable way. Of course, there was slapstick, but a lot of people thought Old Mother Riley was a genuine old woman. And Arthur Lucan didn't really do anything to help dissuade people of this notion, because he was very reticent to present himself as a personality. He very much kind of hid behind the Old Mother Riley role. He would appear, so he had his own radio show and Old Mother Riley commercial recording, and also over 10 films in the Old Mother Riley film series. So there was a sort of, in addition to the stage show, so there's a comic strip too. So there was like this whole Old Mother Riley media franchise, mostly popular with working class audiences, mostly popular in working class suburbs and provinces and working class industrial cities. In fact, the Old Mother Riley films didn't get a West End release until, you know, very late in the series, because he was so indelibly associated with working class audiences. The producers of the films didn't think that the hoity-toity West End audiences would care much for Old Mother Riley. So yeah, Old Mother Riley, Arthur Lucan would appear for radio broadcasts in the full costume and with the script memorized. When he met his co-stars, such as Bela Lugosi, with whom he stars in the last Old Mother Riley film, he introduced himself in character as Old Mother Riley and sort of freaked out Bela Lugosi, who was not a method actor. And in fact, kind of poetically, Arthur Lucan died backstage in the clothes and makeup of Old Mother Riley. He was about to take the stage in a show called Old Mother Riley in Paris, in Hull. And when his cue came, he didn't take it because he had collapsed in the wings and died. And then the next day, the headlines read "Old Mother Riley dies." They didn't read Arthur Lucan dies, because Old Mother Riley was more recognized. Next slide, please. Here we have Dan Leno as Mother Goose. Again, adding emotional complexity to the dame role. This was in one of Dan Leno's famed Drury Lane pantomimes, and he actually played multiple incarnations of Mother Goose in this show. So he played a younger, I think genuinely pretty Mother Goose. He played the older Mother Goose. So there's lots of, it was a quite intense acting role for him, which he played to great aplomb and success. Next slide, please. And here we have Danny LaRue, who's a major presence in the book. One of the most popular performers in 1960s and 1970s Britain, full stop, let alone one of the most popular female impersonators. He had his own club in Mayfair, starred in stage shows, had the longest running Christmas pantomime. To that point, I think his pantomime Queen Passionella and the Sleeping Beauty was first staged in 68 or 69, the Christmas season, and it lasted to June or July the next year. So obviously that's quite a long time for a panto to run. And I talk about Danny LaRue as an example of conservative drag. He was sort of an unlikely champion for people who felt trepidatious about the social changes and cultural changes that went along with the so-called permissive society. And he would often distance himself from homosexuality, distance himself from other drag performers. He claimed that he didn't like to be called a drag queen in his autobiography called From Drags to Riches. So he claimed that he didn't like...
Just to remind you, we've only got 15 minutes left. I don't want to hurry you too much, but I just give time for the questions at the end. Sorry.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to quickly move on. So next slide. Next slide. That's from the Gardiner Collection. Okay, I'm going to quickly run through in for 2 minutes this anecdote, and then we can end. Next slide, please. Okay, so I opened the book with an anecdote that I think reveals the complex ways in which people thought about drag in the 19th and 20th centuries. So this anecdote relates to a show called We're No Ladies that was performed at the 20th Century Theatre in Notting Hill, which I think just recently closed, very sadly. And it was staged in 1958. And it was a drag show, of course. And the Lord Chamberlain's office, Britain's state theatre censor between 1737 and 1968. I believe 1737. That's bad that I forgot that, but yeah, I believe between 1737 and 1968, they were Britain's state theatre censor. You had to, if you wanted to stage a play or new additions to an old script for the public, you had to get it licensed by the Lord Chamberlain's office. And so the Lord Chamberlain licensed this play, We Are No Ladies, but then got complaints about it later, saying that the performers were staging unlicensed material, that the play was obscene. So the Lord Chamberlain sent an undersecretary to review the play, and the undersecretary, Ronald John Hill, recorded his impressions. So first of all, he noted that he was surprised to find that a lot of so-called respectable people were attending this low-class drag show with, quote, many accompanied by wives and girlfriends. Secretary Hill was particularly disturbed. There's a line in the play where one performer says, "Is this a gypsy encampment?" And then the second person responds, "It's camp, all right." And Secretary Hill was disturbed by this exchange. He reported, "The introductory remark, 'This is camp, all right,' which is specialized actors' slang for a homosexual gathering, was greeted with a roar of laughter from the whole audience, who must thus be more familiar with the phraseology of the perverted than appeared." Hill then went on to give the performers a kind of backhanded compliment. He says, "The show was very well dressed. How do they find the money? Some of the actors were so good they might have been thought to be women." So he left the show feeling that the show was ultimately kind of tawdry, but he concluded, there is no law which prevents female impersonation on the stage. It is in fact as old as the stage. So this is Britain's state theater censor. Even though he thinks the show is tawdry, he's deferring to the great theatrical and cultural tradition that drag represents. But next slide, please. Other observers were not so convinced, and they didn't take such a tolerant view of the show. They wrote into the Lord Chamberlain's office, lambasting the show. So you have, for instance, one correspondent named H.C.R.A. Bennett writing in, "We Are No Ladies is in fact a vehicle for the basest perversion, a smutty, badly performed homosexual orgy in which the converted audience joins. It is not even funny." I wish my book got similar reviews. I think that'd really spike up the numbers if someone called it a smutty, badly performed homosexual orgy. Maybe the London Review of Books will do that. Bennett went on to say that these men exist and work their evil on each other, we all know. But to stand and sing the national anthem in both soprano and normal male voices is an insult to a gracious lady in a great position and an affront to English people. At the end of plays and stage shows at the time, it was a tradition to sing the national anthem. This person felt upset that some of the drag performers sang the national anthem in soprano voices. Then you have another correspondent, Brian Boss, writing in saying, "I was appalled and amazed that such a production as We Are No Ladies should be allowed to take place publicly, and even more so that it should be open to youths and children. The Lord Chamberlain should certainly pay a visit to this show and see for himself the blatant and undisguised perversion which is displayed." So you see similar rhetoric, more than 50 years later around Drag Queen Story Hour. By the way, if the Lord Chamberlain's office approved a play at this time, then it was open to audiences of all ages, unless the theater instituted some sort of age requirement. There was no rating system like there was for film. So if the Lord Chamberlain's office approved a play, licensed a play, then usually people of all ages could see it. So presumably there could have been youths and children there. Then another correspondent wrote in, "The entire performance was openly suggestive of homosexuality." And I'm nearly done. I just want to go back 2 slides. So just from this anecdote, we can see that drag represented various concepts in the minds of contemporary spectators. So for instance, airy popular entertainment, a source of humor, second-rate comedy, tackiness, glamour.
I'm so sorry. We just really do need to get to the last slide now.
I'm nearly done. I'm just going to end it here. Sorry. Okay. Time-worn theatrical heritage, pederasty, perversity, homosexuality, evil, and a threat to the nation and national institutions. That's it. If you could go 2 slides more. And yep, that's it. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions. I'm sorry I went over time.
Thanks so much, Jacob. That was fascinating, really, really interesting, and I feel like we could listen to so much more. I just wanted to take a moment for James. I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about the provenance of any of the images that we looked at. I'm happy to point out a couple if you wanted, or if there's any that you particularly wanted to talk about, that you've got a kind of good story behind or anything like that. It would be really lovely to have that kind of context for some of the images that we looked at.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't actually set out to form a collection of men in drag. It's just that when I worked in the fashion business. Thank you, Jacob, for notice that I know a little bit about dresses. I was actually first drawn going through piles of old papers and photographs in Portobello Road way back in the 1960s, when I was still at fashion college. And that's actually what first drew me into these, lots of these images. They are very striking costumes of every period, and drag is an exaggeration. That's the major point. It's always been an exaggeration. So as a young fashion student, who was, that week in college, we'd done a few few sessions on Edwardian costume, and there I am on Portobello Road looking at old photographs of ladies in Edwardian costume. This is back in the 1960s when that kind of stuff was all being chucked out, and suddenly realizing, good heavens, surely this person in that bustle dress has got an Adam's apple for one thing, and rather large feet, and so on and so forth. So I just got drawn into the images that way. And of course, this was back. I said this is all going back into the mists of distant history, when there was so much of history was being thrown out, and before history on paper and colloquial history on paper wasn't considered even remotely important. Chuck it out, uncle has died, and let's clear all those terrible old photographs that he's got, throw them in the rubbish. And that's what happened to so much of it. And so that's how this collection evolved. As I got more and more interested in what I was seeing, I just wanted more and more of it, and it became pretty obsessive. Collecting does become obsessive, I think, and I found that I was going to auctions and boot fairs and and even traveling to California and Austria, and looking for images that in some way spoke to me about what is essentially my history as I was coming out as a gay man. Drag is inextricably mixed into the history of gay culture, and so that's basically what I got into. It became a self-seeking device, really, finding all this stuff. I mean, I wasn't particularly interested in drag for myself, although I did do it once or twice, and I'd like to show you one photograph that was one of it. Can you see that? Is that clear? That's me wearing the green dress, which is in fact a Worth couture dress, in 1967, when we were celebrating law reform. People say, oh, did changing the law in 1967 have any effect on you? And I say, yes, it made me get a dress on and have a party. And so, when we talk about drag, I just want to show you that I do know what I'm talking about, and I've actually done it. So this all became a sort of putting this collection together became a kind of a lifestyle and an exploration into my own life and into gay culture in this country and the history of it, and so on and so forth. And I eventually wrote a book, Who's a Pretty Boy Then? If you can you see this? Long out of print. I wrote that in 1995, which got that whole collection together. And it was actually through that book that I was first approached by the Wellcome, and so that that's sort of the genesis of my collection in the Wellcome. And anything else you need to know? Is that, I think, well, I did a very long interview with the Wellcome, which I think is in the archive somewhere, giving it very detailed. I can go on and on and on forever about this. A very, very detailed history of my collecting. Which goes on, which I'm still doing. It's still out there. You still have to go and look for it. If you're interested, you have to be able to go and find it yourself, and it's still there. And it's not as easy to find. I mean, we've moved 50, 60 years on, and rubbish looks different these days. But one of the other reasons why I think it's so important to do that now is because for the first time since camera film was developed in the 1870s, no one takes photographs anymore. They use their phone, they use their device, and it's gone. So in fact, there's less actual material photographic history now than there has been for 150 years. So get out there, and firstly, I would advise that people get out there and look for it. And secondly, print photographs. Please print your photographs from your phones. It's really important that you leave something behind. We try so hard to find out what people actually look like back in the day, which is what Jacob's been doing, and so much of his research is about that. And of course, in 100 years from now, there aren't going to be, if any of us here at all, there aren't going to be any material artifacts left telling us what we actually look like, which I think is that's a pretty bad thing. Anything else, Jacob, that you might want to ask me? I didn't. I thought your talk was fantastic. The book sounds fantastic, and I know I'm going to get a copy. Is it out in this country now? The book is published here.
Yes, I'll send you a copy, James. Don't worry about it. It's the least I can do. But I can't add much to what you've said, and the gorgeous photo you showed. That was really moving. So I'll keep quiet and let the audience ask you questions, perhaps. Okay. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for the autoethnography, as they'd say in the history profession.
Fantastic, absolute pleasure.
I've actually got a question for you, if that's okay. I just wondered, is there any when you collect, is there any kind of criteria, any kind of thing that you think about which makes you include something, or have there been times when you've thought, no, I'm not gonna collect that, or is it just a very kind of broad brief when you're looking for things?
No, it's pretty broad. I mean, I buy and sell a lot of stuff online, so I buy a whole range of photographic material. I deal on eBay and in Photographica of all sorts, forms of description. So I look for everything. I've got a period. I've got a cut-off date. Really, I'm not particularly interested in very much after about 1960 because it all just seems modern to me, and I don't. I'm not. I just remember it all so well that I think, oh well, I don't need to buy that. And I know it's what younger collectors. The 1960s for collectors now is as far off to them as the Edwardian age to me was when I started buying this stuff. So so maybe that would be concentrating on the 60s and 70s. And there's much, but there's so much more from that period. I think if you're going to look at the later period, there's much more to collect. So, but that's not for me. So if anyway I'm selected, it's that.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I mean, your input has just been. It feels very special being able to see the photographs and actually hearing from you as well.
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much. Jake, a couple of questions from the audience. So the first, so this is for you, Jacob. How did drag performers during New Imperialism relate to empire? Did colonial backdrops, tropes familiar in other musical acts make similar appearance in drag? And did performers tour the colonies?
I think tourists the British Music Hall exported a great deal to the empire. And the great drag performers didn't travel as much as now, but people like Mari Lloyd, for example, I know she's not a drag performer, but she was possibly the most famous British music hall performer of all time. She went everywhere. She famously she was barred from entering America because of the feathers on her hat, or she was living with a jockey who was married to somebody else, so they wouldn't let her in. But she traveled, and I'm trying to think of international travel. Yeah, I mean, the empire was there were obviously at the height of the empire, there were British people living all over the globe, and they needed to be entertained. So sure, entertainers will go out. I mean, drag. I don't think the kind of musical drag that we were used to in this country was essentially it was very working class. That's the other thing. And
can I interject?
Yeah, if you've got some thoughts as well, Jacob, that'd be great. Thank you.
Is that okay? Because actually there is I forget the name of the book, embarrassingly, but there's a new book on Empire that just came out this past year, and it actually opens with a drag event among British expats in Dar es Salaam, just as the war is about to break out. So that's kind of a more casual drag, but I have seen evidence of, for instance, drag in Ensa performances in Egypt and northern Africa. There also, there's in the early 20th century, there was a phenomenon called Salomania, where everyone would have every woman dancer worth their salt, like Maud Allen, would have their version of the Salome dance of the Seven Veils, and lots of drag performers, and obviously that was very much tinted with Orientalism and Orientalist themes, and drag performers would also do their versions of the Salome dance. Some drag performers did like parody versions of the Salome dance, especially during Salomania and afterward. But some would do earnestly kind of sensuous versions of the Salome dance. I also found, for instance, in the post-Second World War, that ex-servicemen's drag reviews, there was often a harem scene, so obviously drawing upon Orientalist themes. And also, I will say that drag and blackface minstrelsy have intermingled. There's a tradition of, particularly in the US, but also in Britain, of glamour drag and sort of pantomime dame style drag in blackface minstrelsy. And in fact, some people have said that the origin of glamour drag in the States comes from blackface minstrelsy, where you have the wench roles and the high yeller gal roles. For instance, Frances Leon was a famous glamour drag performer in the States who performed in minstrel shows. So there's obviously a lot of overlap in that as well.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to move along so we can get our questions kind of. So this is another one for you, Jacob. Do you think pantomime dames are drag? If so, why are some practitioners claiming they are not drag? If not, what are the differences? So.
Yeah, I mean, it's different when you get into a semantic discussion about drag, and I could have maybe called my book Gender Variant Performance in 19th and 20th Century History or something, but I wanted it to speak to modern audiences, so to do that I have to get into a semantic kind of spat, or not spat necessarily, but semantic issues over this term, drag. I would consider pantomime dames to be drag. I think a lot of the general public would consider pantomime dames to be a type of drag, but I found that, and you see a little bit of this in the anecdote I discussed, and I discussed this more in the book, you have some critics of drag in the past, who I mention in the book, say, well, this sort of female impersonation is okay. It's not like this kind, which is gross and disgusting and perverse. So even going back into the 20th century, you still see critics of drag, just as they do today, say, well, this kind of drag is okay, but that's like classic female impersonation. We like that, not like this perverse queer kind, right? So I think it's very self-serving for the critics of drag to not deem pantomime dame performances to be drag, because if you ask them what they think drag is, they'll say, oh, it's men waving their dicks around or something like that. They have this very weird view of drag, that it's perverse. These are the conservative critics of drag today. This idea that drag is inherently perverse, that it's inherently adult entertainment, and it serves their rhetoric to not include pantomime dames in there. And if you mention, even if you mention something like Paula Grady to them, they'd say, well, that's fine. I'm just talking about the new drag that's, perverting children and pushing a political agenda. So if you push them, their ideas of drag are quite narrow.
Could I say something here? I think that pantomime dame is a completely separate genre. It's a very traditional genre, and you can trace the origins of the pantomime dame way back, in fact, to Shakespeare, where certain characters, Falstaff was a very pantomime dame-ish. It's essentially a funny fat person that could necessarily might be an old man and might be an old woman. Mistress Quickly in Shakespeare again is that kind of character, and they were absolutely part of traditional British popular theatre from the middle of the 19th century onwards. I don't think any of it's very gay, pantomime dames. I don't, they are traditionally a kind of a rumbustious. It's to do with I'm sorry, I'm fat. I know you can't use that word. It's fat physical comedy. They were padded out to be enormous, very, very often, and it's not. Drag is something, in my eyes anyway, is something to do with glamour. I think that's the difference. A pantomime dame does not want to look beautiful, unless, of course, some of them did. Douglas Byng, for example, 1952, he always claimed that he was the first performing glamorous pantomime dame. So that, that if there's any kind of crossover or confusion, it can only start at that time, so beginning of the 1950s. And of course, Danny LaRue was a pantomime dame with glamour. So in that context, it is drag. So I think pantomime dames became drag after the 1950s, when glamour was put into the mix. Before that, no.
Well, it's fascinating having these different perspectives, and I think it's what you've both done is really kind of there's so much nuance in this conversation, yes. and I wish we had more time to talk about it, to be honest. Unfortunately, we are going to have to kind of stop things there. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to you, James. Your contribution's been really, really wonderful to have, and thanks so much. Well, Jacob, your talk was brilliant, and it's just a shame we don't have more time to talk about it. Thank everyone so much for your questions, and just a reminder, if you could complete the feedback form, I think the link has been posted in the chat. That would be brilliant. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, James. I really appreciate you coming. Thanks, Leila.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.